Good afternoon. Excited to see both Megan and Shelle here. And thanks for the people who are joining. It looks like we have 20 or 30 attendees. We appreciate your time this afternoon. My name is Alice Loy. I work with creative startups based here in Santa Fe and have been very fortunate to work with Shelle Sanchez, who is the Director of Albuquerque's Department of Arts and Culture, as well as Megan Van Voorhis, who with the city of Sacramento out in California is the Director of Convention and Cultural Services. And these two ladies join us today with what I consider to be some of the most forward and out of the box thinking around how municipal governments can really support dynamic cultural and creative economies. So I'm super excited to have them here with us. And I asked them to just say a word or two about their backgrounds and why they're excited about the creative economy and the work they do. And then we'll kick it off with a few questions. Megan, as a guest here in New Mexico, you want to start?
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for having me. I love New Mexico. It's been so fun to come and visit when Creative Startups has organized events there. So I feel very honored to be a part of your webinar today. Yeah, and I will just say real briefly, spent 17 years working in an arts and culture advocacy organization, a service organization called the Community Partnership for Arts and Culture, then Arts Cleveland. And during the pandemic, decided to make just a huge shift after all that time and move out here to California with my family to take over the cultural and creative economy job. It was just something that I've been passionate about, which is supporting so much of the creative economy, individual artists, music venues, media producers, all of these folks that make that up. And I saw really that there was an opportunity here in Sacramento to do that in a different kind of way than we were doing in Cleveland. So for me, it's been really an exciting transformation. About 2 years in, my predecessor, Jody Ulick, decided that she was ready to move on. And I was like, well, okay, all right, let's just do this. So now I have, a much wider portfolio, but my passion really does remain around building a climate that supports creative activity in its many, many forms. So really excited to be here.
Thanks, Megan. Shelle?
Hello, it's nice to, I can feel everyone, even though I can't see everyone. Yeah. So I'm glad everybody's here with us this afternoon. I've been working in arts and culture in New Mexico for almost 25 years. And now as the Director of Arts and Culture at the city of Albuquerque, I oversee a lot of creative places and, cultural institutions. Our city has a really huge department with museums and libraries and theaters and all of these things that are actually municipal resources, but and it's fun to do things in those spaces, but it's also really exciting to just work in the spaces that support artists as individuals and really encourage creative entrepreneurship and kind of creative capacity across our city and bring our arts and cultural nonprofits together and figure out how to use public resources to really make great things happen in the community. And I think for me, I actually really believe in public service, which is maybe a crazy thing to say in these times, where government kind of gets a bad rap sometimes, but I really believe in public service and in public work. And I think when we're doing our best, when we are helping others in the community, right? So city government can do things by itself, but really when we're putting resources and partnerships and capacity out into our community, that's when we see real success. So that's where my focus, I try to keep my focus in that space.
Well, you do a good job. You are beloved by Albuquerque, that's for sure. So my first question is, you guys have both been working in this sort of realm, arts and culture, and now, more people talk, I guess, about the creative or the cultural economy. How have things changed? Like when you cast back to 20 years ago, the challenges, the opportunities to now and looking forward, how have things changed for cities, for creatives? What's the first thing that comes to mind?
You want me to jump in a little bit?
Sure, yeah.
Go ahead, Megan.
I think one of the things I noticed when I started back in 2003 with my career in this work, you know, there was so much that we were focused specifically on nonprofit arts and cultural organizations in this lens. And in Cleveland at that time, it was really, there was no public-private partnership around the arts and culture, right? We had all of these, imagine an industrial city built up to emulate, you know, the best of those things that they had on the coasts in their view, like what that access was, and wanted to have that there. And so they invested deeply with all of those industrial dollars, right? But then as times changed for Cleveland, they had a huge impact in terms of how to sustain that set of assets, and particularly while also supporting individual artists and a core of creative activity that wasn't happening through those kinds of things. And so there was, you know, I remember doing a lot of case making at the time around that. And now I look at it and I think like the conversations we're having about arts and culture and in general, they're much less siloed. So like I think about all of the discussion regarding arts and health and human services and how we can advance that. And I think, you know, all about like, what is the role of the arts and culture in our neighborhoods, and how is like, you know, tech and creativity coming together to advance social change. Like these are conversations that for me feel very vastly different than the kinds of conversations that we were having 20 years ago. And I find that really exciting.
Mm-hmm. Shelle?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And I think very similar. I think 20 years ago, there was this clear shift from institutions, cultural institutions being kind of the place where you lead these conversations and where everything happens, right? And everything is curated. And those institutions were becoming less and less gatekeepers and more places where things happen with community, instead of, you know, kind of like a place where you go and visit and you see what the experts have decided to offer you up. So that to me has changed a lot. Another thing that I think has changed so much, and I feel like we don't even notice or we've forgotten, is the avenue that artists and creatives and content makers, or whatever you want to call them, have for their own distribution, right? So that means cultural institutions and cultural kind of policymakers, you know, we have a really different role, because you know, there's people can share their creations in so many different ways, through social media, through the internet. Yes, but also the financial access or the financial barrier to so many things is so much lower. I mean, you know, creating a movie 20 years ago, creating a movie 10 years ago, and creating a movie now, you know, almost anybody can do it if they have the right amount of creativity. And that just shows in so many other spaces. And so that has pushed, I think, blurred all these lines that you were just talking about, Megan, and has kind of forced us into a much more interesting and dynamic conversation with creators and audiences and institutions.
What are some of those conversations you're having, Shelle?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, before, when the only place was for artists to show their work was in either a gallery or in a museum. And now people can show their work often in coffee shops and, you know, in other spaces, or show their work online to a really big audience. And if you're a good marketer, you have a good, you know, you have the ability to really create your own following. It's a really different, the role of the museum then, or the role of the theater, or the role of whatever, is just really different. That a lot of times it's in conversation as equals with those artists and with those creatives. And, you know, and it's not confined just to those kind of traditional cultural spaces.
You know, I'll jump in on that too, just with a couple of things that I've seen recently with people that we've been working with. There's a wonderful artist here, Ruben Ravelis, who is digital media, as well as he's really interested in how that comes together in the human space as well. It's just really interesting. He's Chicano artist. And but it's interesting, like we have conversations about like just the role of galleries, right? And you know, one of the things that he's working on is, you know, in the digital space, like you create an avatar and you go into a digital art show, and what a totally different kind of experience to have. And then just yesterday, someone had posted about this project in West Hollywood, and they were using, billboards basically. And it was a media project where they had invited artists to do these installations on these billboards. And so you're having this different kind of artistic experience in relationship to that. It really just like opens it up and uses that in a new way. And I think those things are really exciting. It's like a new medium to test and play with, that seems really cool and very different.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think cities, and I know Megan, you're working on it, is how to deal with policies and codes that reflect, the cultural district, which could be, a very isolated sort of, in Santa Fe, it would be like Canyon Road, or in Cleveland, there was the cultural district.
Yeah.
But art and culture and creativity is happening now in street music and street festivals and markets. And I chair a board of an immersive theater company that performs in historic homes that are in neighborhoods. And culture has moved out of the cultural district, right? And that presents an interesting set of challenges and opportunities for people who are responsible for managing code around noise, around all kinds of parking, all kinds of stuff. What are cities doing around that?
I will speak to what our city is doing about that now, but I will say when I arrived in Sacramento in 2020, I mean, this was the conversation that we were having with some people when I'm just sort of getting on the ground and I'm saying, hey, let's talk about reopening. What does that look like? And people were like, I'm out. Can we talk about the preconditions here before we even talk about reopening? And then they would just unload on me about like how difficult it was to do special events in the city and get through the processes and how things would hold up. And then, so much of the stuff that was happening underground, or in homes, with like 40 or 50 people that would be just sort of under the line. And you go, there's just sort of like a culture. It had been this culture that had developed over time. And sometimes I see this a lot, like you get in government, something happens and the slap back on it is significant, right? Oh my God, we have got to protect against, this stuff happening again. And so you get these policies and then you forget where those policies came from over time. And then bureaucracy just adds up. And so I think one of the things
calcifies them.
Yeah. And it's tough. I had my mentor, Tom Shorgle, who used to be with the Indiana Arts Commission for 10 years. He was, he was the president of an organization I worked for in Cleveland for a long time. He was saying like, it's always easy to add bureaucracy. It is very difficult to take it away. And I didn't fully understand that. I mean, I kind of did when we were doing the work, but it was like a small independent organization was one thing. But when I got here, I'm like, whoa, because you have all of these layers of people and decision makers. And for this kind of activity, in our case, people for whom the function that they need to be performed in reviewing a permit isn't their core responsibility, right? It's like an add-on responsibility to something else. And so all of these things can add up. So for us, it's been kind of like taking a step back, and me being like a research oriented person and data oriented person. It's like, hey, build the case, help provide the data. We did this Sacramento music census just to create a picture of what we knew, how things were impacting the community, then shared that internally with the folks, and then did an arts and entertainment regulatory review where we got information and shared that. And it was that data and that information that has actually now moved the needle, that we were able to make the case with our folks, which we're a charter form of government, which means I work for the city manager, and then there's council, and we're having to, figure that out together. And now we're going to create an entertainment services division, which now will be in convention and cultural services, and that's on deck for next fiscal year. We're going to try to create a single point of entry and try to address some of these things. But it really does take attention and nuance and being sort of like a translator for the creative community when it comes to talking with all of these other people to help them understand, like, yeah, we do storefront stuff. And you got all these vacant storefronts right now.
Right.
And so we shouldn't be like,
we're your
making
solution.
it hard for people to be able to
Megan,
do
that's
that.
a really interesting point, because one of the things that we notice at Creative Startups, because we work with really innovative, what we call weird and wonderful people, who, when they start out, everybody goes, ooh, that's weird. And 5 or 10 years later, it's wonderful, because entrepreneurs are building the future. We just don't know it yet. We're not there yet. They are, right? And so now you see street art as lauded, street murals as ways to help reinvigorate and beautify. But 20 years ago, that was not okay. So what's ironic is these solutions that creatives often bring are not perceived as solutions, and yet they often are what cities are needing, right? They need to revitalize, they need to redevelop, they need to inject new energy, attract young people, et cetera, et cetera. And the very people doing that are often the people fighting the codes, because the way that they're doing it doesn't fit the old system. And what concerns me is when that old system rears its head and says, well, that's not the way we do it, which serves to exclude some people, oppress other people. How are cities able to work around this challenge of the innovative sort of eating up the old and the old really fighting it, whatever that old structure might be?
Yeah, I mean, you have to have people in positions of leadership that are willing to say yes and find a yes. And you also, though, you also have to have respect, and that's what I hear from Megan. You also have to have respect for the rules that are in place and understand why they were in place, right? I mean, government is a stabilizing force in our communities, right? So you don't want it just like whooping around and
Yeah,
changing
yeah,
everything every other week, right? You know, that stability, the part that makes us crazy about it, also is really important.
right.
And so, but you do have to really, when you're in these positions and you have the opportunity to make things better, you know, you have to be ready to do it. And you have to push hard and you have to make really solid research and information-based decision. I mean, we spent a year
Yeah.
and a half, just almost 2 years getting e-approval, which is our permitting software, which is where you can do it all from one point of entry, you know, through our department, fill out your online application for your special event permit and get it all reviewed, which seems 100% normal in like 2024. It also seemed normal 3 years ago, but it was really hard. You know, you have
Yeah,
to
to get
push
it set up.
because that's like a
Yeah.
real user friendly but hard you know, transition for government, but we did it, you know. And so you just
Yeah.
have to push and you have to bring everybody along, but remember that there's a reason that there's so much stability, but also know that you're there to make changes and to make the right things better.
Yeah.
Alice, there's a book I would recommend. I think I might have recommended it to you when I first read it. It's called Recoding America, Why Government is Failing in the Digital Age and How We Can Do Better. It's an amazing book by Jennifer Palka. And she led the she was part of US Digital Service for some time and Code for America and all of these things. And it's for people who really want to understand what is at work, for those of us who are working in the municipal space, that book, I felt like, I mean, the opening, like the dedication to the book is to public servants everywhere, like, don't give up. I mean,
Wow. Yeah.
but I think for people who are really interested in understanding kind of the dynamics that we all face in putting things together, it's a really great book. And for me, also very useful as we're trying to think about how do you improve this stuff? You know, how do we deploy a user experience design to help us shape? And I think like for Shelle and for others who are in this space, right, the creative people, we do have an opportunity to showcase for others in our municipalities what we model that in terms of the work. And I think that's the opportunity.
Yeah. So I just want to remind everybody that we can see your questions that you post in the Q&A. So if you have questions, maybe questions you asked in the poll or maybe the chat, we can actually only see them in the Q&A. So drop your questions there. One thing I wanted to explore a little bit is how rural communities, and this is something that we spend a lot of time, 1 in 4 New Mexicans lives in a rural community, how rural communities can engage more successfully in the broader creative economy so that it's a viable economic opportunity for their communities.
Well, I mean, I'll just say that, you know, for Albuquerque, we're definitely a city, but we're smack dab in the middle of New Mexico. And so there's so much interaction we have with the broader state, and many of the opportunities that we create for artists as individuals, either through our public art program or, special initiatives through our museum and other places are open to artists statewide. And so I think that's one really important thing. And then, in improving this infrastructure of communication is the other thing, and some of this is where I think, arts and culture have to be in all the conversations, not just because I'm, want to be in every conversation, but I do think it belongs. There's so many, and especially in New Mexico, so many creatives, a lot of them living on native lands who make at least 25%, sometimes 50% of their living from the creative economy, right? Through artisan work, but they're living not in the city, they're living in rural spaces. And so that the infrastructure that we think is so important for just fundamental growth and improvement in our communities, water, high tech, high speed digital, all of these all of these things are the same things that creatives need. And so sometimes I think we separate, like, what does a creative need? They need everything that everyone else needs, right? The things that make our world better make the world better for creative entrepreneurs. And so I think, that's just, without trying to separate it, it's not any different. It's the same stuff. But the difference is now that with that connectivity, and as we're improving it in New Mexico, people can participate, even if when they choose to live in a nice, quiet, rural space, they have so much access to all the things we were talking about earlier, right? You don't have to go someplace, as evidenced by today, to have a really meaningful interaction and participation.
The other thing I'll share with this, which might seem odd, Alice, but I'm not sure if you're aware of this project. So the state of California invested $60 million in a one-time funds for the California Creative Corps, with the aim of putting artists to work around communications campaigns on things like social justice, environmental issues, all of those kinds of things. So, which is really lovely. We went in for the Capital Region Creative Corps, and in our region, that to serve as sort of the anchor for that, the administering organization working with people from throughout the region. And, it doesn't take too long from Sacramento to get into very rural areas, It's cool. So we have a partnership with Arts and Culture El Dorado, and Yellow Arts and et cetera, who are doing these things. But one of the projects that came out of this, which is really related to fires, so significant in that area, and really trying to do that, is that anchor, a project called Forest Song, and the aim of really like helping people to educate people around those kinds of things. And I think that kind of thing is just, there's so much opportunity in it. And what I appreciate about what we were able to do is just be able to be an anchor or a connection to those folks in those communities as well, to be able to get the resources to them so that they could do whatever they needed through that project. So I just think there's a lot of opportunity in that kind of work overall. And it's going to take a different brand, or it's going to take its own, create its own brand. And I love that, right? Because you're using whatever is available to you. And that's how we all sort of grow creatively.
A woman yesterday told me that in the state of Washington, they have an artist in residence at their Department of Transportation who helps design all signage, and it rotates. And I thought, that's cool. That is so cool. It's so small. It feels like a small thing, but and what you're saying, Megan, about having this creative core, I mean, that's like dreamy for us. Imagine if we had a core of creatives in New Mexico who could work on projects related to environmental, outdoor recreation, all the things that matter to us. That would be amazing. Speaking of which, I mean, that sort of touches on the finance piece. And I know that, Shelle, you have figured out some ways to make the city's resources more available, more fluid, I guess I could say, going back to that issue of bureaucracy. What are some of the ways that the city of Albuquerque and then city of Sacramento have figured out to help on the funding side of creativity?
Well, I mean, there's several things in the city, and I'm going to first give credit to something that goes way back, just to say that, I have the benefit of leading in a city that has been very forward thinking on many different occasions. So we have one thing that's called the Urban Enhancement Trust Fund, and this provides funding every 2 years to arts and cultural nonprofits. And that was first established, I think more than 40 years ago by a very forward-thinking city council at that time that just took a big, a big surplus and actually put it into a trust fund. And so that funding comes from, comes from the interest on that trust fund, which is amazing. And we're now using some of that money each year to work with 3 or 4 anchor nonprofits in the city to fund residencies, but at-home residencies, and rather than artists having to leave to go find a cool residency somewhere else, we're funding projects in the residency in conjunction with these local nonprofits. So that's a really creative use. Another thing that we've done, and that's coming through our public art program. So also, I have really creative staff that work here too. So Sherry Brueggerman at Public Art has really,
Yep.
she always has a great idea. And we've been able to make a lot of them happen. And we increased our, with city council, with the mayor, with everyone on board, we've gone from 1% to 1.5% for the arts on our capital program, which is great, which means we have more money for conservation. We still have 1% of that. So the 1% of 1.5 still goes to art purchases, but that other 0.5% supports conservation, and it supports digital and temporary art. And so, one of the things about, we were just talking about how a lot of times government is a little bit behind, right? And digital and public art, digital and temporary art has been around for a very long time. And is important, and we see it in all different kinds of ways. But public art programs have to really buy something that's kind of, because it's capital, and we're like, we need a thing, and it's gotta last because that's what we do. But we just rewrote the ordinance, and we worked with our city council, and now we can use some, a percentage, a designated percentage on temporary art and on digital art, which is like, that's amazing. So that also means those are smaller projects, which means we can fund more of those. And so it's also a great entry point. And then we've just taken some of our discretionary money, because this is spaces that I think are important. And we've started a city makers program. So kind of like a poet laureate, but an artist, and they come in and they get a part-time job, and they can design their project. They can work with any department in the city, and they can learn how to work inside the bureaucracy and get something done and get paid. We've worked with artists at work at a national level to have New Mexico artists get a full-time salary for a year with benefits. So some partnerships. So it's really about where you put the money and how you leverage your partnerships. And you can make a lot of big things happen in, a relatively short period of time.
Megan?
Yeah, I would, we have been pretty lucky, I feel like, throughout the pandemic, to have had a really amazing leader in Mayor Steinberg, who said, we're not going to just use the funds in this way. We're going to use it. We're going to use our CARES dollars and our American Rescue Plan Act dollars to be able to support the creative economy. And so that's given us, I think, a runway both to help the field with recovery, but also to try some new things. If you say, like, the sector was impacted, so how do we build for a new kind of environment, which is, some of the things that we're working on now as we look to creative businesses and how we're supporting them. We have, it is very difficult. It is very difficult for artists to work directly with the city of Sacramento. We also, as a part of the Creative Corps, we did hire 5 artists who are in residence throughout. One is in planning, one is in transportation, one is in our parks department, one is in our community engagement. And I will just share, why not, oh, you're not going to be able to see it. Like,
put it right in front of your face.
Yeah. This is a zine. So our artist in residence for the city, in the community engagement, decided to, like, that part of their job is helping people access city resources, right? And so she's like, well, this is it. She comes up with a zine. She publishes it monthly. We share it out. It's digital, and it's just another way for people to be able to access information, which I really love. And we have tried some new things, working with IOB, which is out of New York, which is more of like crowdfunding and matching, which is designed to, like, kind of reduce the barriers for people to have access, people who don't have an easy time writing grants. right? Like, how can we help incentivize and build their capacity to be able
Yeah.
to do these projects, which on the creative economy side or an entrepreneur side, right? Like, that's friends and family, right? We're just creating the vehicle to be able to access this and get a little incentive to be able to make it possible for people to do those projects. But on this one too, I will just say building partnerships internal to the city is really, really critical.
Yeah.
And it's true that the city is very siloed, but everybody has in their department people who just like to talk to other people, right? We connect them,
Yeah,
we
those
empower them,
connectors. Yeah,
right?
those
With the
natural connectors.
information that
Yeah.
becomes a conversation. So we ended up securing like the state had launched this Clean California program. Many hundreds of millions of dollars devoted to help, cleaning up in very specific projects. And as a part of their effort, they wanted to really target specific areas. Like I'll give an example. The Healthy Places Index is one of those tools we use. We want to get into the lowest quartile of those, like as an example. And so when we put our projects forward as a city, we as a city team from all sorts of departments were coming together and brainstorming like what would work. And it turned out in that conversation that for every one of the 5 projects that ultimately got funded by the city, there was an arts component. Why? Well, because it was part of the conversation and people were saying, we can do this. So like we have a major project going on with the trail transformation that, they were working on already, and they wanted public art. They wanted art along the trail. And so we have like these 5 major sections now that's going to be really exciting. And then, these like major installations. And I'm like, there's a rail. I'm the entrepreneur in me just can't help myself because there's a rail line. And I'm like, rail bikes, that's what we need.
Yeah.
Rail bikes too.
Megan, I'm hearing you say, get out of your own sort of, I am an artist and I make what I want, and instead rethink and be a little more entrepreneurial and think, okay, what are the potential partners or projects I could be involved in? And it might not be exactly the way I like to do my art when I do my art my exact way, but it sounds like the market is, the city has this new project where they're redeveloping a rail trail and they're going to need public art. And I don't know if I do that, but I'm going to get into that conversation and I'm going to give myself the flexibility to see if maybe that's how I do my art, right? That to me is a little bit of the shift from the pure artist to the creative entrepreneur. And the dance and the tension then is, how do you not lose your vision for your artwork and your expression while you're meeting the need of a client or a community partner or an audience that maybe you wouldn't normally serve. But that's an interesting dance. That's an interesting conversation. And we have seen that it is a more lucrative conversation for creatives because they've moved outside of their own, this is the way I do things, and instead, this is the way I respond to the market through my creativity. One of the things that we're tasked with at this new creative industries division is helping New Mexico build an industry. In other words, one of the things that we all struggle with as creative economy people is it's super fragmented, which is good in that it helps generate a lot of creativity and people get to be more individualistic and exploring their own personal expression and all these things. But when it comes to like legislation that could support the creative economy, there isn't a unified voice. We're not Intel with 2,000 employees who can say, we want this. So in our journey of building an industry of creatives here, what are the things that, and I'm going to ask Megan because she has the benefit of not, seeing the forest for the trees, right? You don't live here. What are some of the things that New Mexico could do in shaping a creative industries division that would actually be useful for creative people, that would actually help them be able to make a living doing their creative work? Kids would get to become more creative through their educational journey. Employers would get to hire more creative people, all those things. If you had a blank slate, what would you say to New Mexico we should do?
I have many thoughts on this.
I bet.
The first one I have really is centering creative people, creative individuals. And there is a lot, I think, to touch on your point, we don't have a the one organization to like, one ring to rule them all, right? Like there's not one that really touches on that, and you've got little pieces advocating for each other. But we have an organization here called the Capital Creative Alliance, and they sort of bust all of that up, right? Like it's just individual people who are working and centering that. And I think there's really something to doing that across the board, that I would really just advocate for, because I just fundamentally believe that any sort of creative industry, any sort of that, just it starts with the people who make it. And we have come up over time with these various organizational architectures for which these things can happen. And it's just a huge reason that I feel like it's valuable to invest directly in creative practice and giving people the space. We do this in science all the time.
Yes.
We make
Yes.
fellowships available for people to be able to do this so that we can push these things along. And for whatever reason, in the creative space, it's like, so sure about that. It's a little touchy. And yet there's an enormous amount of like growth that can come from that. So that would be one thing, Relegae. I'm just like,
Oh, can I jump
people.
in on that one, Megan?
Yes.
I gotta jump because I gotta say 100% yes to that. One of the things that we did in the first couple of years, and then, COVID broke things and we're still trying to put it back together. But one of the things that we did, and we invested a lot of time and some money, but mostly time and energy, was in something we called tipping points. And the real initiative there was to bring artists together, creatives, however they identified, and invest in them. We had a whole process that was really about helping them figure out what their next tipping point is. Like, what's the next thing you need? And not saying like, not laying out a curriculum for them, but bringing them into really intentional conversation with other peers, not like, no lectures, but bringing them into really good, facilitated, powerful conversation with each other. And then in certain places, we were able to fund or resource, because we can't always fund directly, an individual. But like if there's 4 people that say, I need this kind of coaching, or I need this kind of learning,
Mhm.
well, we can create
Yeah.
that for
Yeah.
you. And we did this, and we saw 2 things happen. One is they were like, oh, and that tipping point for many of them really did. Once they got that piece, the next things happened for them, and sometimes in really big ways. The other thing that was happening, that was one of the most powerful things about it, is they were building new connections and networks and partnerships with each other. And they were growing other projects by being in conversation, going back to what you were saying, Alice, earlier, like this collaborative space and working outside of your own box and making these things. Like that's where the magic happens. And that's where it happens in research and like in science, all of these other things. But investing that time to create that network, it's some of the best work I think we were doing early on, and something we hope we're going to be able to do in this next fiscal year as well. But I am with you. We don't need to decide what people need. We need to create spaces where they can learn what they can need, and we can resource that, and we can strengthen the networks.
Absolutely.
It makes sense. When we talk about our work, and it's like, how do you build a climate that supports these things? And that's one of the things that we've been doing with our American Rescue Plan Act dollars, is like, okay, who are all the players in the space, and how do we make sure that they're needed? And one of the things that we're doing is funding arts journalism, because the reality that we're facing,
that's huge.
I'm just going to give this an example. Very, very excited about this person, the Philharmonic. I don't know if any of you know this, won the Tiny Desk contest for NPR, and is from Sacramento.
I heard that.
We had an opportunity to talk about it. And one of the things that we were talking about is the role, like, how do you make these bridges, create bridges out? And I think that's related to the network conversation. But, in that one thing, like lots of people in the scene already knew the Philharmonic, right?
Yeah.
But it just exploded in terms of everybody else who did. And that's the powerful role that, journalism and coverage can play.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at the market dynamics that have really just shaped all of that industry, now we're losing that. And I think, people like, oh God, for 20 plus years now, everyone's talking about, let's create a calendar. Like, I'm so over it. I don't want to hear about any other calendar ever again. Like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to look at a list of things that I don't know, but it's like, you have an opportunity now if we have that kind of coverage to get to know the person and the artist, and now all of a sudden you're like, I want to go see that show
Mhm,
because you
mhm.
understand you have some backing. And
Right,
now
you read the
across
story,
city, I
yeah.
will tell you, I shared that video
Yeah.
with the city and people were jazzed about it. But it's
Yeah.
those kinds of things, right, where we're investing in those like kind of keystone investments that can potentially yield other things and serving as a bridge and connecting out to other players, which I think we're seeing a lot in the arts and cultural space, you know, with state arts agencies, National Endowment for the Arts facilitating those conversations.
Yeah.
Those same things can happen in the creative economy space with all of those other economic development players and helping to service translate. So those are my thoughts.
You know, if I try and summarize, I mean, I would want to process more about what you guys are saying, but what I hear is that in New Mexico, the Creative Industries Division needs to create space for creatives to be successful, but can't make creatives successful. Like we can't, and we don't foresee that the division would do things like give grants to artists. And not only does arts and culture do that really well, or they do it, and it's not our role. But we also don't have anyone advocating for that space and making, you know, and saying, well, let's fund a statewide culture rag that is just for, you know, people in this realm. And so that's kind of what we had been leaning toward, but we're checking on what people are doing around the country that works well and seeing what we could do here. What are some of the benchmarks you guys use when you measure how well your city is doing in terms of supporting creatives? Are there benchmarks that you use? That this is a tough question, right? Because the NAICS codes, for people who don't know, the NAICS codes, the North America, oh gosh, industry and classification something, are assigned to every single type of job an American can have. But unfortunately, they don't really reflect the reality of 2024. They kind of look like 1980. And so when we talk about measuring the creative economy, it's hard because when you make the argument, you were talking about how important data is, when you want to make the argument for why states and cities should make more opportunities happen for creatives, that data can feel a little mushy, unlike manufacturing. Manufacturing has very hard data.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if there are things that you guys have figured out that you measure or you can tell the stories of that help convey how important the creative economy is to a region. It could be jobs. It could be one of my favorite statistics from a report we did a long time ago. Creative Startups did a report in like 2010 or 12 that showed that in Native communities in McKinley County, which is Gallup, New Mexico area, creative entrepreneurs, Native creative entrepreneurs, had a higher likelihood of having intergenerational households, which is a good thing because for Native communities, you want that intergenerational living because then the kids are getting to learn the language and the cultural norms, and there's continuity of the Native culture. And that to us was a beautiful statistic that nobody probably else would care about, but we knew that that was very meaningful. And I wonder if there are other interesting ways you guys have thought about conveying the importance of the creative economy in your town.
Well, I mean, we are doing, we just completed a public art census, which is really interesting because the public art census, it's not like we just went and counted all the stuff we've ever funded. It was much more interesting than that. It's like, what are all the creative objects that are out in the community? And, you know, like a very small percentage of those are, you know, publicly funded public art, you know, by our definition. That's really interesting because that says a lot about our city as compared to other cities. We're real creative. We already knew that. We're real proud of it. So Bernalillo County and the city of Albuquerque work together on that. You know, we are getting ready to, we're working with the Bureau of Business and Economic Research at the University of New Mexico. We're going to do a comprehensive research study update of the research that was done 10 years ago on the creative economy. That was the whole state. We're just focusing on the city.
Yeah.
But you know, for me, it comes down to like the percentage of like, where are we putting the dollars that are discretionary? Are we putting them directly into artist-led projects or artist benefiting projects? You know, the artists that are working with us, are they like, if they were working with us a year ago or 4 years ago, what are they doing now, right? Are they getting to bigger and bigger projects? So for example, we had a city maker last year who, she did an interesting project with us, and it was really, it was good, but she has leveraged that time to work and that opportunity into 2 very significant large public art projects that are that are funded from completely different sources. So if I look back, like the people that have been involved in the programs that we have, like, is it taking them somewhere? Then yes, we're doing the right kinds of things.
Yeah, you've
And,
created
you know,
a
and where are
runway.
we, yeah, and where are we investing our money? Is it benefiting lots of artists?
Yeah.
Or benefiting the artists deeply? And so those are kind of, I mean, we have the big metrics, of course, you know, how many people are we serving? How many new public artworks did we put out? How much money did we spend on them? All the, and you know, all the obvious things. But yeah, I mean, are people translating these experiences that we're creating, and are they leveraging them for their next big thing? That's for the kind of work we're talking about today,
Yeah.
that's the kind of success.
It's interesting. I mean, having been involved with data in the arts for so long and so many economic studies, like I can say, recent one aside, which is way more creative than anything we've ever done before, or I've ever been involved with before. The data, the federal data, it's really hard to keep up with it, but it's like a starting point, right? Because in some communities, you might not have that data capacity. It's useful, to be able to grab onto it. I think about 2 things in this. One of them is, what are the conditions that create a supportive climate, and how are we measuring progress against that? And I'll just, I remember one of the first projects I was involved in 2003 was at the time when the Ford Foundation was funding, and I'm sure I have it sitting up here, the Investing in Creativity study. And I mean, this was a landmark study focused on, looking at investments in individual creativity. And Maria Rosario Jackson, now our wonderful National Endowment for the Arts chair, was a big part of that, working around the country to say, like, what are the conditions that create a supportive climate? And then they create these 5 or 6 different dimensions on which that, things like information and demand in markets and capacity, professional development and investment and all of those things. For me, that was like a framing device that I feel is very enduring and is applicable across every part of the creative economy, whether you're working directly with individuals or nonprofits or arts and cultural organizations or collectives. And I think that's just served me well over the time, saying, well, what's missing? Media coverage is one of those dimensions, focused on information, what are we doing over there? So that's one piece. And then I will just say that I think this is really critical, that we collect and disaggregate information based on race. And these various dimensions, because it's really critical for us to be transparent with the people we serve about where the investments are going. And that's one of the things that, it takes some capacity to build and do that work. And, but I think it's really been very useful for us to begin to unpack some of those things and then say, well, we've made these investments here, and now we really need to do something to make these investments here. And yeah, I think that is something that serves us well as well. And something that I just think is really key we should all just be doing that all the time.
So there are a couple of questions. We have 10 minutes left, and I want to get to these questions. One is from Sydney, who was a panelist yesterday with us. Hi, Sydney. And Sydney asks about performing art and how can cities support performing art. And I'd like to couch that within one of the observations that we have made, which is that we are moving away from collective art that you collect. We are moving toward, and what future generations seem to want is experiential art. They want experiences. And so when Sydney asks about performance, I think, that's the future. In many ways, we see young people engaging with performance art more than paintings, things that you can acquire and take home. Might be where they're at in life, but how do cities effectively support performing artists? Especially when they're not, as we said, in these anchor, the opera or the.
I think that one is a challenge, and I will say why it's more of a challenge than the visual art. Because 40 years ago, 50 years ago in the United States, many cities started having the 1% for the arts program, right? And so that was tying visual art and like kind of beautification and the creation of art and integrating it into our public space and our public works with capital dollars. And so
Right.
that means we have a consistent funding source. And so that's why, I mean, I think it feels like
Yeah.
to artists, like, oh, you like
Like it's
visual
a
arts more.
preference, but
Like,
it's
no, we
just
don't
a
like it. We
reality.
don't like it more. We just have money for it every single time we have
Interesting.
bonds. So the question is, you know, for those of us that are policymakers or decision makers, like, how do we start identifying that ongoing source
Mhm.
and that reliable source of funding
Yes.
for media, for digital arts, for performing arts. And so we do that somewhat through our Urban Enhancement Trust Fund. It does not match the budget we have for public art, visual
Yeah.
art. We can do some of it with the money that I was talking about for temporary art. Like we can use some of that for performing arts, but not in the same way as I know that, you know, the question is referring to. And so it's
Right.
definitely something that we struggle with and we're trying to
Huh.
figure out. But that's what it comes down to. How do we find the funding and dedicate the funding? Because that's when those sectors grow, is when they have consistent funding. And it doesn't even have to be millions of dollars in a city like Albuquerque. It can be $150,000 or $250,000 that's shared that can make a really big difference. So, you know, it's a
Interesting. That's
policy
useful.
question
Yes.
and it's a long-term stability question.
Yeah. Yeah. So true. There's also a comment here from a Mr. Hakeem Bellamy, who some of us know and love.
Some of us know and love
Yeah,
very much.
just some. Hakeem, I don't see a question here, really, just some interesting comments. But if you have a question, you could repost it. You know me, I tend to need a direct. You got to hit me over the head with stuff.
You know, Alice, I want to jump in on
Yeah.
the performing arts
Yeah.
question because there's some
Yeah.
really interesting things that I think connect to this on the health, arts and health front. What we're seeing with social prescribing as a tool and conversations, you know, we've been having, those of us who've been really interested in arts and health as a vehicle. And, you know, you think about things like there are policy tools that exist out there, right? Flexible spending accounts, health savings accounts that enable and encourage people to be able to engage. Like those are things on the social prescribing front that we might consider
That's
as
interesting.
ways that kind of
That's really cool.
the state passed legislation for the equitable payroll fund. And this is something that I think is really just relevant to this conversation. I talk to musicians and they're saying, I'm making the same money I made for a gig for the last 30 years. And, you know, that the pay equity conversation, I think is
Huge.
really, really critical here, and
Yes.
how municipalities sort of model that. I mean, we have prevailing wage if the city puts money in construction projects that, you know, sort of requires certain things. And so you think, well, you know, if the city is putting money, you know, what are the standards that we're setting for people around this discussion of pay equity? And so they set, the state did this whole, it's equitable payroll fund. And
That's
part of this
amazing.
came out of the, like, you know, Uber and,
Right. Yeah.
Senate bill, like that
Gig
whole,
economy issues.
that whole
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, but, you know, you think about those kinds of conversations, how can we model that?
Right.
In terms of the investments that we make and set a standard for how
Yeah.
we pay for, you know, performing
Yeah.
artists. And then also, how does that play out in terms of the other people that we're funding and just the broader climate? I think there's more conversation to be had about that, but I think it's
Yeah.
really critical.
Well, and you know, that brings us back to the Creative Industries Division in New Mexico's role will be to help organize people, not its only role, but part of what it will do is organize people around issues exactly like that and stay abreast of what is going on around the country where we could say, ooh, that's a good idea. Let's do that here. And so part of what we've done in bringing Megan in here with Shelle is to exchange ideas from outside of New Mexico so that we could learn about things like having a print, a rag journalism around culture and creativity in our communities. Megan talked about public-private partnerships, the idea of buying in bulk. I thought of, you know, we could be buying accounting services, legal services. You guys had my notes or I have 2 pages of notes from everything we talked about today, using public resources in new ways. And I want to thank you because both of you have been devoted to arts and culture and now the creative economy for 20 years.
And the work that you do has changed a lot of lives. And I know it's not easy work and you have survived bureaucracies, but you keep trudging forward and doing it elegantly. So thank you very much. Thanks for spending an hour with New Mexicans today. Is it okay if people want to get in touch if they ask me for your email? Can I share your emails? Okay.
Definitely.
I mean,
Thanks.
I'm
So-
pretty sure we're both public servants, so public is encouraged to reach out.
Yeah, so if you have follow-up questions, let me know, and I'll put you directly in touch with Shelle VanEtten, who is the Director of Arts and Culture for the city of Albuquerque, and Megan Van Voorhis, who is the Director of Convention and Cultural Services for the city of Sacramento. Thanks, you guys.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Have a great evening.